After the chaotic days of the 1940s, large ships being sunk in combat became a rare occurrence. It certainly happened, with examples like the Falkland War. However, it was by no means common. That makes many of the examples in this time period pretty famous. Ships like Belgrano are well known and very well studied. A decade before that cruiser sank, and on the other side of the world, a less famous incident occurred. An ex-British destroyer was sunk in one of the endless conflicts in the Middle East. And I'm not talking about the more famous A-Lot here. No, this video will look at the ex-HMS Myngs. In 1970, this ship was serving under the Egyptian flag as El-Qaher. This was a time period where the Suez Canal was closed, and the destroyer was, as a result, stuck in the Red Sea. In the off-and-on conflict with Israel, this would see El-Qaher sunk, and it happened in a way that her designers could never have even dreamed of. After all, the F-4 Phantom was certainly not an expectation in the early 1940s. Let's look at that sinking and how HMS Myngs ended up in that position in this video, beginning, as always, with the design detail. HMS Myngs began her life as a Z-class destroyer. I touched on those ships, part of the War Emergency Program, in my video on HMS Zenith. The most notable feature of this specific class was a new fire control director and the use of single-mounted 4.5-inch guns. For the more specific details, Myngs displaced around 1,700 tons on her standard loading. This would have risen to something around 2,500 tons at the full load. With that displacement, the destroyer carried 4 of the aforementioned 4.5-inch 114mm guns, in 2 single mounts superfiring on the bow, and a further 2 superfiring on the stern. The offensive weaponry was rounded off by 2 quadruple torpedo mounts, both amidships, for a total of 8 21-inch torpedoes. The anti-aircraft weaponry, for its part, varied wildly. Each of the ships in the class could, and would, have different layouts, and at different times. With the war emergency ships, the British tossed on whatever they could find. This generally meant a mix of 40mm pom-poms, 40mm Bofors, and 20mm cannon. But the exact number and type would vary on each ship, or when you were looking at the ship. In any case, all of this was pushed through the water by 40,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts. This could bring Myngs to a top speed of around 37 knots. Now, with all of that done, we can look at the service history. Such as it is, because Myngs joined the Royal Navy very late in the war, with all that implies. The destroyer was laid down on May 27, 1942, and launched on May 31, 1943, about a year between keel laying and launch. Another year and change would follow for the fitting out process. This was, apparently, slowed down by delays in delivering her new fire control equipment. Myngs would only commission on June 23, 1944, after the Normandy landings. By this point, Italy had switched sides, and the U-boat threat was mostly gone. Not entirely, of course, but certainly not the threat it was 3 or 4 years before. The Japanese Navy was still a going concern, but Myngs would not serve in the Pacific. No, she spent her entire wartime career in the Atlantic and Arctic on escort duty. This began in August of 1944, with the destroyer joining operations off Norway. Primarily mine-laying operations at first, but there was a moment of excitement on August 15th. That saw Myngs escorting British carriers for one of the many operations against Tirpitz. Not that Myngs herself had much to do there. There were a couple submarine and air attacks which crippled HMS Nabob, which was an interesting ship in her own right as one of the escort carriers that saw a second life as a freighter. As for Myngs, she went undamaged during this process. The same would hold true for the remainder of 1944. From September through November, the destroyer was either in Scapa Flow or sailing on mine-laying operations. Not a lot of excitement, but it was an indication of how beaten Germany was. They couldn't contest these operations, either from the air or sea, by this point of the war. During this period, the only real action came on November 12th. Myngs joined a handful of other destroyers to escort HMS Kent during an attack on a German convoy. 2 freighters and a couple minesweepers were sent to the bottom during this action, after which Myngs returned to Scapa Flow once again, where she would remain through to the new year. 1945, for its part, began with convoy escort duty. Myngs sailed on January 1st with an Arctic convoy for Russia. This went without incident, storms aside, on both the way to Russia and the return trip home. The same would hold true during further mine-laying operations in February 1945. No enemy shipping was found during this process. This was fairly typical late war service, for better or worse. As a result, Myngs' last bit of excitement in British service reflected this. In March of 1945, the destroyer joined one last convoy to Russia. This would see HMS Lapwing and a merchant sunk on March 20th. However, Myngs took no damage of her own. She would leave Russia with the return convoy and arrive back in Scapa Flow by the end of the month, at which point the destroyer reverted to training and other secondary duties through to the end of the European War, which then shifted to occupation duties along with supporting the fleet through to August and the end of the war with Japan. Myngs never ended up sailing to the Pacific. She remained in European waters as war gave way to peace. With the glut of destroyers and other ships left over from the war, Myngs was soon reduced to training duty. She would last on this role through 1954, before entering British Reserve in September of that year, at which point she was selected for conversion to a Type 15 frigate. However, Myngs would never see that conversion. She would, in fact, spend very little time in British Reserve. In 1955, the destroyer was stricken and put up for sale. This would see her sold to the Egyptian Navy alongside her sister Zenith in the same year. While Zenith would be renamed El-Fateh and endure until the 2010s, Myngs would prove less fortunate. Renamed El-Qaher, the destroyer was overhauled for Egyptian service. However, this took place at a time when the British and Egyptians had rather frosty relations. This would eventually culminate in the Suez Crisis in late 1956. The mess that this entailed could very easily have derailed the transfer of Zenith and Myngs. However, it didn't. There may have been issues on either side, but in the end, the sale went through. The British government was keenly aware of how it would look abroad if they refused to transfer the ships, especially since it would make other nations less likely to buy British surplus, which was a source of income the government couldn't exactly risk losing. As a result, El-Fateh and El-Qaher would be transferred to Egypt. Her service in the Egyptian Navy past this point is hard to make out. Much as with Zenith, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of English language literature on this topic. Even Arabic language sources seem to be thin on the ground. From what I can tell, the destroyer served on anti-submarine duty off the Egyptian coast, or alternatively on training duty. While regional tensions were high, the Egyptians were at peace for a time, and there was little need for El-Qaher to do much. Because of this, the only notable thing before her sinking that I've found is a return to Britain in May 1963. And this was just a minor refit, mostly focused on overhauling the ship, with little in the way of modernization. El-Qaher returned to Egypt in more or less her Second World War configuration. Now, to this point, her career is more or less a mirror of her sister, El-Fateh. Things would change at this point as El-Qaher sailed into the Red Sea. This would position her as an important part of the Egyptian fleet in the area, but it would also leave her stranded in the area after the Six-Day War in 1967. With the closure of the Suez Canal as a result, the destroyer was left to idle in the Red Sea. The only way to return to the Mediterranean and proper dockyards was to make the long voyage around Africa. The Egyptians weren't exactly keen on this, and instead signed an agreement with India to let them use Indian dockyards. This was a stopgap by all accounts, and El-Qaher would not receive any major refits or overhauls for the rest of her career. although rest of her career is 3 years in this case. After a refit in India in early 1970, El-Qaher returned to Egyptian waters. She was based out of the port of Berenice, which was judged as a safe distance from Israeli air bases. As it turned out, this wasn't the case. On May 16, 1970, Israel sent 8 F-4 Phantoms south. These planes would hug the Saudi Arabian coast as they flew down the Red Sea. Each aircraft carried the heaviest bomb load they could manage, while still having enough fuel, with mid-air refueling, for the round trip. This was, arguably, overkill for a single old World War II destroyer, and assorted smaller ships as well. However, the Israelis weren't sure what the Egyptians had for defenses, so the size of the strike makes sense in that context. At any rate, the strike went in. The second pair of F-4s would be the ones to do the deed, as they circled around for a second pass. 3 or 4 bombs, big 750-pounders, struck El-Qaher. Unsurprisingly, this wrecked the antique destroyer. The superstructure was torn apart, and one of the 40mm mounts was blown off the ship. The destroyer burned for around an hour, finally sinking in shallow water. Her wreck remains there to this day, gradually decaying as a victim of the changing times. No one in 1942 could have expected supersonic bombers dropping from the sky, to say the least. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.